Hello, my name is Danny Horn. I'm 29 years old, just an ordinary guy raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, where the scent of the Mississippi River blends with the aroma of beignet coffee and the sound of saxophones echoes through the cobblestone streets. But if you think my life is a smooth jazz melody, you're mistaken. My life, at least up until now, has been more like an unfinished symphony, filled with harsh low notes and chords that are often overlooked. Today, I'm sharing my story with you, not to boast, but to help you understand that sometimes what's dismissed as nonsense can be the spark that leads you to the light. I was born into a middle-class family in a quiet neighborhood with white-painted wooden houses and low fences. My father, Joseph Horn, was a banker with a mind full of numbers and dreams of stability. My mother, Fiona, was a sharp-witted woman who took pride in keeping our family up to standard in the eyes of the neighbors. And then there was Marco, my older brother, 3 years my senior, who was seen by the whole family as a radiant sun, while I, was just the faint shadow beside him. From a young age, I was different. While Marco loved playing football and dreaming of sleek cars, I found joy in my mother's small kitchen. That kitchen, with its worn wooden table and the faint smell of spices, was my world. I remember afternoons when I was 7 or 8, climbing onto a chair, sneaking potatoes and carrots from the fridge, and clumsily chopping them to try making a soup I'd invented. Once I burned an entire pot because I was too engrossed in adding just a bit of butter, and the acrid smell made my mother rush into the kitchen shouting, "Danny, what foolish thing are you doing now?" But I didn't feel foolish. I felt alive, truly alive, when I held a knife, stirred a pot, and smelled the aroma of the dish I'd created, Athenaeum created. That passion grew with me, but it wasn't welcomed in my family. My father would look at me with disappointment, as if I were a bad investment. "Cooking? That's for hired chefs, Danny. Are you planning to spend your whole life in a kitchen?" he'd say, his voice dripping with sarcasm whenever he caught me secretly trying a new recipe. My mother was gentler, but no less cutting. "Danny, you should study something more practical, like Marco. Your brother will work in real estate with a 6-figure income, buy a house, a car, and you, what are you going to do with those pots and pans?" Marco, he was the pride of the family. Tall, handsome, with a smile that easily won people's trust. Marco studied finance at a prestigious university, and from the age of 18, my parents boasted about him everywhere like he was a gold medal. "Marco will be a big success. He's got a business mind," my father would say, his eyes gleaming when he looked at my brother. And me? I was the son with no future in my parents' eyes and the weird younger brother in Marco's. I was the one who, at family gatherings, was only mentioned with sighs or chuckles. "Danny? Oh, he's playing with his vegetables in the kitchen again." I didn't fully blame them. I understood that in their eyes a son had to be strong, make money, have status. Cooking to them was something lowly, meant for those with no better options. But every time I heard those words, it felt like someone was squeezing my heart. I wanted to scream that I wasn't just playing with vegetables, that I saw an entire world in every knife cut, every drop of oil sizzling in the pan. I wanted them to understand that for me, cooking wasn't just a job. It was art, passion, the way I told my story. But I never dared to say it. I just bowed my head, quietly kept chopping onions, letting my tears blend with the stinging scent of the onion. My childhood passed like that, in the small kitchen and under skeptical gazes. I learned to hide my passion, like a secret no one could know. I started jotting down recipes in an old notebook, its pages stained with ink and cooking oil, where I recorded every idea. From an improved gumbo with fresh shrimp to cornbread baked with honey and herbs. That notebook was my only friend who understood me, the place where I poured my dreams of one day standing in my own restaurant, where people would come not just to eat, but to feel. But that dream in my family's eyes was just a joke. When I was 15, I excitedly showed my mother an étouffée I'd spent all day cooking. I'd carefully chosen fresh shrimp from the market, measured every spoonful of seasoning to capture the rich flavor of New Orleans. I thought she'd be proud, or at least try a bite, but she just glanced at it, sighed, and said, "Danny, stop wasting time. You should study properly like Marco. Did you know your brother just got a scholarship?" Those words were like a knife, cutting deep into my pride. I stood there watching the étouffée grow cold, feeling like the whole world was laughing at me. Marco, of course, never missed a chance to remind me of my place in the family. I don't think he meant to be cruel, but he enjoyed the feeling of being the better one. "Danny, why don't you try learning something more practical? What's cooking going to get you? You'll just be a servant to others your whole life as a chef," he'd say with a half smile. I didn't respond, not because I agreed, but because I knew arguing was pointless. In Marco's eyes, in the whole family's eyes, I was the failure, the one who'd never match my brother's brilliance. Those years taught me to live with comparison. Every dinner, as the family gathered, the conversation revolved around Marco, his academic achievements, his grand plans, or how his boss praised him during his internship. I sat there, eating quietly, listening to the praise for my brother, feeling invisible. Once I tried talking about a jambalaya I'd just made, hoping someone would care. But my father cut me off. "Danny, don't interrupt. We're talking about important things." Important things. Right, my cooking was never important. As I grew older, I realized my passion wasn't just disregarded, it was seen as shameful. My mother began worrying that I'd bring shame to the family if I kept obsessing over pots and pans. "Danny, you can't keep going like this," she said, her voice full of anxiety. "What will the neighbors think? They'll think we raised a son who's good for nothing." I wanted to scream that I didn't care about the neighbors, that I just wanted to be myself. But I couldn't. I just nodded and returned to the kitchen where I felt safe, where I could be Danny, not Marco's useless brother. By 17, I started dreaming of leaving home, escaping the judgmental stares and suffocating words. I wanted to attend culinary school, to turn my passion into reality. I secretly researched schools in New Orleans, even applied for scholarships. But when I hesitantly told my parents about my plans, their reaction was worse than I'd imagined. My father slammed the table, shouting, "Culinary school? Are you insane? You think this family has money for you to waste on that nonsense?" My mother cried, saying I was embarrassing her, that I wasn't thinking about my future. I stood there in the living room, feeling like the world was crumbling. I wanted to tell them I didn't need their belief, I only need them to give me a chance. But I knew no matter what I said, they wouldn't listen. In their eyes, I'd always be the failed son, never worthy of the pride they gave Marco. That night, I sat in my room staring at my recipe notebook. Its pages were filled with dreams, dishes I wanted to create, restaurants I wanted to build. I knew that if I wanted to make those dreams come true, I'd have to do it myself. No one in my family would support me, no one would believe in me. But I believed in myself, and that was the start of my journey. A painful but hopeful one. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and told myself, "Danny, you'll do it. No matter what they say, you'll prove them wrong." That was the moment I decided that, even if the world turned its back on me, I wouldn't give up my passion. I would turn that little kitchen into an empire, and one day they'd see me differently. But saying it is easier than doing it. At 18, while my peers were excitedly packing their suitcases for college, I stood at a crossroads with empty hands. My parents wouldn't allow me to pursue culinary school. "That's a waste of money, Danny," my father said, his voice cold as stone. "If you want to study something that makes money like Marco." Marco by then was a third-year finance student, predicted to become a star in the real estate world. And me? I had only my stained recipe notebook and a heart full of determination, but not a cent to my name. I knew I had to fend for myself. I left home not out of anger, but because I couldn't keep living in Marco's shadow under the disdainful gazes of my family. I rented a tiny room in the French Quarter where the smell of bourbon and the sound of jazz filled the streets. The room was cramped with peeling walls, but to me, It was freedom. For the first time, I felt I could breathe, even if it was in short, halting gasps amidst the struggles of those early days. To make ends meet, I took a job as a waiter at a local restaurant called La Belle Creole, a small place always packed thanks to its famous gumbo and crawfish étouffée. The job wasn't glamorous like my dreams, but I didn't see it as a step backward. To me, it was the first door into the culinary world I longed for. During each shift, I rushed back and forth between tables, hands carrying heavy trays, ears catching the laughter of customers, the clink of cutlery on plates, and even the complaints when a dish wasn't to their liking. I observed everything: the way the chefs shouted in the kitchen when orders piled up, the way the manager smiled to reassure VIP guests, the way each dish was carried from the kitchen to the table. I learned that every detail, no matter how small, could be a lesson. I started noting how the chefs combined ingredients, the timing for each dish, how they handled the pressure during peak hours. I watched the manager, learning how he interacted with customers, how he managed difficult situations while staying professional. I even paid attention to how customers reacted to each dish, what made them gasp in delight, what made them shake their heads. All of it was part of the larger picture I was quietly piecing together, the dream of owning my own restaurant. But my family didn't let up, even after I'd left home. Occasionally, my mother would call, not to check on me, but to urge me to rethink my future. "Danny, you can't be a waiter forever," she'd say, her voice heavy with disappointment. "Look at your brother. He just signed a contract for his first house. How long are you going to live like this?" I clenched my teeth, swallowing the pain. I wanted to tell her I wasn't just a waiter, that I was learning, building the foundation for my dreams. But I knew she wouldn't listen. To her, to my father, to Marco, I would always be the failed brother. Late at night, after long shifts, I'd return to my room, sit under the dim light, and open my recipe notebook. I'd jot down new ideas, dishes inspired by New Orleans but infused with my own touch. A bit modern, a bit bold. I imagined a restaurant called The Golden Fork, where people would come not just to eat but to experience the stories I wanted to tell through each dish. In those moments, I didn't feel alone. I had my passion, and that was the flame that kept me going. But life was never easy. Days of 12-hour shifts, feet aching, back sore, made me question if I was on the right path. Some nights, lying on my creaky bed, listening to the crickets chirping outside the window, I wondered if my parents were right. Was I chasing a pipe dream? But then I'd remember the aroma of the first gumbo I'd successfully cooked, the smile of a customer who tasted a dish I'd secretly made in the restaurant's kitchen. Those moments reminded me that I wasn't just working. I was living. One evening, as I was wiping down tables after a shift, the manager called me into the kitchen. "Danny, want to try cooking the special for tomorrow?" he asked, half joking, half serious. I could hardly believe my ears. This was my first real chance to step into the kitchen, not as a waiter, but as someone creating a dish. I nodded, my heart pounding. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up writing recipes, mentally rehearsing each step, each spice. It was the moment I knew I was getting closer to my dream, even if just by a small step. But to me, that step was an entire world. But that world came crashing down one evening I'll never forget. It was a regular shift at La Belle Creole, where the warm golden lights of the restaurant danced on white-clothed tables and the aroma of jambalaya filled the air. I was carrying a tray of wine to table 7, offering a polite smile to the lively group of chatting guests, when the front door swung open. A group walked in, their laughter ringing out over the gentle jazz music. I glanced over and my heart seemed to stop. It was my father, my mother, Marco, and a young woman with glossy brown hair clinging to my brother's arm. Alessia Romano, Marco's girlfriend, whom I'd only heard my mother mention a few times over the phone. They were here for dinner, and I, the useless waiter of the family, stood before them in my black apron with a tray of wine in hand. The distance between us wasn't just a few meters, it was an entire world. Their world was one of numbers, investment projects, and glamour. Mine was one of plates, customer greetings, and the flavors of food. My heart sank. For a moment, I considered dodging them, slipping into the kitchen and asking a colleague to take their table. But I couldn't. I steadied myself and approached them, greeting them as I would any other guests. "Good evening. Please follow me," I said, keeping my voice calm as I led them to a table near the window. My father looked at me, his eyes flickering with surprise before quickly turning into a smirk. "Danny, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery, as if my waiting tables was a joke. My mother shook her head, her lips pursed tightly as if just seeing me was enough to embarrass her. Marco, with his arm around Alessia, laughed loudly. "Oh, Danny, still stuck here, huh? I thought you'd given up this nonsense by now." I bowed my head, gripping the wine tray tightly, forcing Traded to keep a professional smile. "Please place your order," I said, handing them the menus. Alessia looked at me, her eyes sparkling with curiosity but no malice. She probably didn't know much about me beyond whatever stories Marco had told her. Surely nothing flattering. I turned away, my heart pounding, feeling like the entire restaurant was watching me. But the truth was, no one noticed except my family. And somehow that made it worse. When I returned with their drinks, their conversation had shifted to a familiar topic: Marco and his success. "Marco just bought his second house, did you know?" my mother said, her voice brimming with pride, as if I wasn't even there. "A beautiful penthouse in the city center. He even bought me a new Mercedes." My father nodded, adding, "Yes, that boy knows how to invest. Unlike some people who waste their time on frivolous things." I knew he was talking about me. I always knew. I stood there, silently taking their orders, feeling like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. Alessia, perhaps sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. "Danny, how long have you been working here? You seem very professional." She smiled, but Marco cut in before I could respond. "Professional? Ha! He's just a waiter, Alessia. Don't flatter him too much." The table erupted in laughter, as if Marco's comment was a brilliant joke. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I said nothing. I couldn't. I just smiled, nodded, and walked away. In the kitchen, I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to keep the tears from spilling. I wasn't crying out of sadness, but out of anger, out of the helpless feeling that the whole world seemed to be on their side. A co-worker, a guy named Tommy, clapped me on the shoulder. "Hey, Danny, you okay? Who were those people?" I shook my head, not wanting to explain. "Just some people I know," I said, my voice hoarse. Tommy looked at me with empathy but didn't press further. I was grateful for that. Throughout the evening, I kept serving my family's table, bringing out their dishes, refilling their wine, clearing their plates. Every time I appeared, Marco tossed out another jab. "Look at that, Danny, you're quick at this. Maybe you were born to be a waiter." My father laughed loudly, my mother just shook her head, and Alessia started to look uncomfortable but said nothing. I endured it, every second, every minute, feeling like my self-respect was being crushed under their words. But I couldn't let them see me weak. Never. As their meal neared its end, Marco called me over, holding up the bill with a smirk. "Hey Danny, tell me, how much do you make a month with this gig? Enough to pay for that rundown room you're renting?" The table laughed again, except for Alessia, who now stared down at the table. I looked straight into Marco's eyes, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for asking, but I'm fine. I get by." I turned away before he could say more, my heart feeling like it might explode. That night, after the restaurant closed, I sat alone on the curb watching the Mississippi River glimmer under the moonlight. I didn't cry. I wouldn't let myself cry, but I felt a fire burning in my chest, not anger but determination. They could laugh, they could belittle me, but I wouldn't stop. I would prove I wasn't the pathetic waiter they thought I was. I would make my dream a reality no matter what it took. From that moment, I felt a surge of strength. Each day that passed, I worked harder, not just to earn money, but to learn, to hone myself. At La Belle Creole, I was no longer just a waiter. I began asking to help in the kitchen during slow hours, assisting the chefs, learning how they measured spices, how they transformed raw ingredients into dishes that made diners gasp in delight. I noted everything, from how to chop onions without tearing up to how to make a rich roux without burning it. Every tip, every mistake was a brick in the foundation of my dream. But I knew I needed more. Working at La Belle Creole was a good start, but to truly break into the culinary world, I needed formal training. I started researching culinary schools again despite the lingering pain of my parents' rejection. I secretly applied for a scholarship to a prestigious culinary school in New Orleans, the Culinary Institute of Louisiana. I spent countless nights perfecting my application essay, writing about my journey, how the kitchen had saved me from disdainful glances, and my dream of building a restaurant that didn't just serve food but told the story of the people and the land of New Orleans. I included a recipe of my own, a reimagined gumbo with fresh shrimp, local herbs, and a touch of cayenne for a kick. It was all I had, a story, a recipe, and a heart full of hope. The day the acceptance letter arrived, I could hardly believe my eyes. Not only had they accepted me, but they also awarded me a full scholarship for my outstanding culinary talent and inspiring story. I stood in my tiny rented room holding the letter, and for the first time in years I cried. Not out of sadness, but because it felt like finally someone saw my worth. Not Marco, not my parents, but me, Danny Horn, the one always called useless. Culinary school was a new world. There I wasn't the mocked waiter. I was a student, respected by my instructors for my dedication and creativity. I learned about cooking techniques, flavor pairing, restaurant management, and the philosophy of sustainable cuisine. I became enamored with the farm-to-table concept, using fresh local ingredients to honor the farmers and the land that nurtured them. I began dreaming of a restaurant that wouldn't just serve food but would bridge people, nature, and New Orleans culture. After graduating, I didn't rush. I knew I needed real-world experience to stand firm. I worked at various restaurants, from small riverside eateries to upscale establishments in the city center. I learned how to manage teams, handle crises when the kitchen ran out of ingredients, and satisfy the most demanding customers. Every shift, every drop of sweat was a step toward my dream. Then came the day I decided it was time. With the savings from years of relentless work and a small bank loan, I opened my first restaurant, the Golden Fork. The name came from a childhood memory when my mother jokingly said I'd need a golden fork to succeed. I chose it not to prove her wrong, but to remind myself that I could turn mockery into motivation. The restaurant sat on a quiet corner of the French Quarter, with red brick walls and large windows overlooking the street. I designed the menu based on the farm-to-table philosophy, blending traditional New Orleans dishes with my own creative touches. The signature dish was a crawfish étouffée with a rich sauce, fresh herbs, and a hint of white wine, the dish I'd once cooked for my mother, which she never tasted. On opening day, I stood in the kitchen, hands trembling as I prepared the first dish for customers. I didn't know if anyone would come, if anyone would understand the stories I wanted to tell through my food. But they came. One by one, then in groups, the restaurant began to fill. Diners praised the food. Local newspapers wrote about the Golden Fork, commending how I brought a new breath to New Orleans cuisine. Within 6 months, I paid off the bank loan. A year later, I opened a second location, then a third. The Golden Fork wasn't just a restaurant. It became a phenomenon, a destination for food lovers across America. I didn't stop there. I integrated technology into operations, from online reservation systems to software tracking ingredient sourcing, ensuring transparency and efficiency. I worked with local farmers, building sustainable relationships to secure the freshest ingredients. The media took notice. One day I received a call from Forbes, inviting me for an interview for their 30 Under 30 list. I could hardly believe it. Me, Danny Horn, the waiter mocked by his family, was now being recognized as a game changer in the culinary world. That interview, with a photo of me standing in the kitchen of the Golden Fork, became a milestone in my life. But I knew my journey wasn't over. Meanwhile, my family had no idea. I hadn't contacted them, not out of anger, but because I didn't want their old words to shake my resolve. I heard through the grapevine that Marco was still thriving in real estate, that my parents still boasted about him everywhere. But I didn't care. I had found my path, and for the first time I felt truly alive, not to prove anything to anyone, but to live true to myself. But life, like a jazz tune, always has unexpected notes. One afternoon, while I was checking ingredients in the kitchen of the Golden Fork, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother, brief but enough to make me pause. "Danny, your brother is getting married next month. You have to come. It's family." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Family. The word felt so foreign now. I hadn't spoken to them since that humiliating night at La Belle Creole over 3 years ago. I didn't want to go, but a part of me, the part that still remembered my childhood when my mother used to stroke my hair and my father taught me how to ride a bike, couldn't say no. I texted back, "I'll be there." That was it, nothing more. Marco's wedding was held at a luxurious hotel in downtown New Orleans with a lavish banquet hall, sparkling crystal chandeliers and tables draped in white silk. I walked in, wearing a simple but neat suit, feeling like a stranger in my own family. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of fresh flowers. Marco, in an expensive tuxedo, stood among the crowd, radiant like a star. Beside him was Alessia, the beautiful bride, in a pristine white gown, her smile dazzling but her eyes tinged with a hint of tension. I wondered if she truly knew Marco, or if she was just swept up in the glow he always projected. I tried to stay in the shadows, avoiding people's gazes, but it wasn't long before my mother spotted me. "Danny, there you are." She pulled me toward the main table where my father, Marco, Alessia, and a few acquaintances sat. I gave an awkward smile, feeling like I was stepping into an arena. My father looked at me, his eyes carrying that familiar trace of disdain. "Danny, still working at that restaurant?" he asked, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, I'm at the Golden Fork." Marco, sipping a glass of champagne, burst out laughing. "The Golden Fork? Sounds like the name of some greasy diner, doesn't it? Danny, you still waiting tables?" His laugh echoed, drawing a few chuckles from those around him. Alessia frowned, glancing at Marco as if she wanted to say something, but she stayed silent. I clenched my fists under the table, struggling to stay calm. "Not exactly. I manage it," I said evenly. But Marco wouldn't let it go. He turned to a middle-aged man beside him, probably a colleague, and said loudly, "This is my little brother, the cheap waiter, always dreaming about pots and pans instead of getting a real education." The table erupted in laughter, as if I were a living punchline. My father nodded, adding, "Yeah, Danny's always been odd. Not like Marco. He just bought his 3rd penthouse, you know." My mother smiled, but her eyes looked at me with disappointment, as if I were a stain on the family's perfect picture. I sat there, feeling exposed before the crowd. The laughter, the curious glances, it all cut into my self-respect like knives. But I didn't react. I couldn't. I just gave a faint smile, took a sip of water, and told myself, "Let them talk. You don't need to prove anything." The reception continued, and I tried to blend into the atmosphere, though every minute felt like torture. Marco, as usual, was the center of attention. He moved from table to table, shaking hands, laughing, boasting about his latest real estate ventures. My parents followed, proudly introducing him to everyone. "This is Marco, our son, a star in the investment world." I stood in a corner of the room watching them, feeling like I didn't belong. A few acquaintances recognized me, exchanging polite small talk, but I knew they didn't really care. To them, I was just Marco's brother, the faint shadow not worth noticing. When the main course began, I thought I could slip away quietly. But then Marco called me to the stage. "Come on, Danny, get up here and say a few words for your big brother." He laughed loudly, his eyes gleaming with mockery. I wanted to refuse, but the gazes of my mother, my father, and dozens of guests watching me left me no choice. I stepped up, took the microphone, my heart pounding. I looked at Marco, at Alessia, at the room full of strangers waiting for me to say something, probably expecting another joke about the waiter. "Congratulations to Marco and Alessia," I began, my voice slightly shaky but steadying as I went on. "I'm not great with words, but I wish you both happiness. Marco has always been the pride of the family." I paused, feeling like my throat was closing up. I wanted to say more, to talk about my journey, about the golden fork, about the sleepless nights building my dream. But I knew no one here cared. I set the microphone down and stepped off the stage as scattered applause followed. Marco clapped me on the shoulder as I passed, whispering, "Nice job, Danny. At least you didn't ruin the vibe." I didn't respond, just kept walking, feeling like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I wanted to leave that stifling room, to escape the pitying glances and the mockery disguised as smiles. I was used to being looked down on, but tonight, in the opulent atmosphere of Marco's wedding, the pain felt sharper than ever. I just wanted to step outside, breathe the New Orleans night air, and forget the feeling of being an outsider in my own family. I made my way toward a corner of the room, intending to quietly grab my coat and slip away. But then, a voice cut through my thoughts like a knife. "Wait, Danny Horn? Are you the Danny Horn from the cover of Forbes?" The voice came from the VIP table, where a group of businessmen were chatting animatedly, their champagne glasses glinting under the chandelier light. I turned around, stunned, unsure if I'd heard correctly. The man who spoke was middle-aged, dressed in a gray suit with silver-streaked hair and eyes sparkling as if he'd just discovered a treasure. I recognized him. Richard Langston, Marco's boss, a prominent figure in New Orleans real estate. He stood up, holding up his phone, the screen glowing with my picture on the cover of Forbes, the bold headline reading, "CEO Revolutionizing American Cuisine." The room fell silent, as if someone had hit a pause button. Whispers began to ripple from table to table like waves across water. I stood there, my heart pounding, feeling like the entire world was watching me. Not with disdain or pity, but with curiosity, astonishment, and something like admiration. "Is that really you?" Langston continued, his voice brimming with excitement. "I read your feature last month. The Golden Fork. Your restaurant is taking the world by storm. You didn't tell me you had a brother this famous, Marco." He turned to my brother, his smile wide but his eyes carrying a hint of reproach. I glanced at Marco. He stood there, champagne glass in hand, mouth agape, his face pale as if he'd been slapped. My father, sitting beside him, suddenly went quiet, his hands gripping the napkin tightly, his eyes avoiding mine. My mother fidgeted, smoothing her hair repeatedly, her lips moving as if to say something, but no words came out. Alessia, the beautiful bride, looked at me with wide eyes as if trying to reconcile the pathetic waiter Marco had described with the man standing before her now. Yes, that's me," I replied, my voice soft but clear, struggling to stay calm despite the storm raging inside me. Langston laughed heartily, stepping forward to shake my hand with a firm, enthusiastic grip. "Kid, you're a phenomenon. I ate at the Golden Fork 2 weeks ago. That crawfish étouffée, my God, I've never tasted anything like it. And your farm-to-table philosophy, absolutely brilliant." He turned to the crowd, his voice full of enthusiasm. "Everyone, this is Danny Horn, the man who's turned American cuisine into an art form." The whispers turned into lively murmurs. A few people pulled out their phones, searching immediately. "It's him!" a woman at a nearby table exclaimed, showing her phone to her friend. "Look, it's the Forbes cover. He's got 3 restaurants already." Another man, who I later learned was Alessia's father, a prominent figure in the import-export industry, stood up and approached me. "Danny, I'm Vincent Romano," he said, shaking my hand with rare sincerity. "I've heard about you, but I never expected to meet you here. Your restaurant is a gem of New Orleans. We should collaborate someday." He smiled, clapping me on the shoulder like we were old friends. I stood there amidst the praise and handshakes, feeling like I was living in a dream. Just minutes ago, I was the cheap waiter in my family's eyes. Now I was the center of attention, not because of Marco, not because of my parents, but because of me, Danny Horn, who had built an empire from nothing. But I didn't let the moment sweep me away. I didn't want to gloat or show off. I just smiled, nodded, and said, "Thank you all. I'm just trying to do my job well." I glanced at my family again. Marco was now forcing a strange smile, but I saw his hand tremble as he set his champagne glass down. My father, for the first time in his life, lacked his usual smugness. He bowed his head, quietly folding his napkin as if trying to make himself smaller. My mother started babbling to a woman next to her, her voice faltering. "Oh, Danny. He's been doing something. We knew he had talent, but..." She trailed off, unable to finish because even she didn't believe what was happening. Alessia, the only one in the family who hadn't joined in the earlier mockery, looked at me with a different expression. Not admiration, but a quiet respect. She stepped closer, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said softly, "Danny, I'm sorry. I didn't know. You're truly amazing." I nodded, saying nothing. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need any apologies from them. I turned to the room, my voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you all for your support, and thank you to my family." I paused, looking directly at my father, mother, and Marco. "For always reminding me I was just a waiter. It pushed me to try harder." The room fell silent, then a few claps broke out, scattered at first, then swelling into a round of applause. I didn't look at my family anymore. I didn't need to. I knew what they were feeling: shame, embarrassment, and perhaps a flicker of regret. But to me, that no longer mattered. I walked out of the banquet hall not to escape, but to breathe the air of freedom. Outside, New Orleans was alive with the faint sound of a saxophone drifting from a street corner and lights reflecting on the Mississippi River. I stood there under the night sky, feeling like I'd shed a burden I'd carried for years. I no longer needed their validation. I had proven myself to myself, and that was what mattered most. In my heart, the fire still burned, but it was no longer a flame of anger or a need to prove anything. It was a fire of pride, of someone who had walked through darkness and found his own light. I knew my journey wasn't over, but tonight I had won. Not against them, but against the doubts that once held me captive. Marco's wedding ended in a haze of artificial glamour, but I knew that beneath the forced smiles and congratulations, my family was facing a silent storm. After the moment of being exposed in front of 100 guests, my parents and Marco stopped mentioning me. Not in conversations afterward, not in gatherings with friends or colleagues. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that my mother had tried to explain to a few people at the wedding, fumbling as she said, "Danny's had some success, but we didn't want to brag." But the truth was, they were ashamed. Not of me, but of themselves. For the years they'd belittled me, called me a pathetic waiter without ever knowing how far I'd come. I returned to the Golden Fork, where I truly belonged. In the days following the wedding, my restaurant remained bustling, with customers coming from all over. From New Orleans locals who loved my crawfish etouffee to international tourists who'd read about me in Forbes. I opened a 4th location, then a 5th, each one embodying the farm-to-table philosophy I'd poured my heart into. I began working with community organizations, donating food to charity kitchens and hosting free cooking classes for kids in underserved neighborhoods. I wanted the Golden Fork to be more than a restaurant, a symbol of perseverance, of the belief that anyone could rise no matter their starting point. But my family didn't vanish as I'd hoped. After months of silence, my mother started calling again. The initial calls were polite inquiries, her voice softer than before, but I could sense the awkwardness. "Danny, are you doing okay? I heard your restaurant is doing really well," she said, as if trying to erase the years she'd called my passion nonsense. I responded briefly, politely, but didn't let the conversations linger. I wasn't angry, but I no longer craved her validation. My father never called, but I heard he'd started bragging to neighbors that my youngest son is famous in Forbes. I gave a wry smile when I heard that. Now that I was successful, they wanted a piece of my spotlight, but I was no longer the 15-year-old boy desperate for their praise. Marco surprised me the most. One evening, he showed up at the Golden Fork unannounced. I was in the kitchen checking a new crab bisque for the menu when a staff member rushed in and said, "Boss, someone named Marco Horn wants to see you." I froze, feeling the past flood back. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked out to the front, and saw him standing there, dressed in a still expensive but slightly wrinkled suit, a forced smile on his lips. "Danny, long time no see," he said, his voice lacking its usual smugness. I invited him to sit at a corner table, ordered a glass of wine for him, but I didn't sit down. I stood looking at him, waiting. "What are you doing here, Marco?" I asked bluntly. He laughed, but the laugh couldn't hide his discomfort. "Oh, I just wanted to see how you're doing. Heard you're a big deal now, Forbes and all." He trailed off, looking around the restaurant where customers were chatting lively and the clink of cutlery on plates rang out like music. "You've done well, Danny. I'm proud of you." I almost laughed. Proud? Since when did Marco know that word when it came to me? I didn't respond, just nodded, waiting for him to continue. And then he got to the point. "Danny, I'm working on a new project, a big condo development. I need an investor, and I thought you could help. You're doing well, right?" I looked at him, not surprised, but still feeling a pang in my chest. Not because I was disappointed, but because I realized that to Marco I was still just a tool. This time not for mockery, but for exploitation. "Marco," I said, my voice calm but icy, "I'm just a waiter, remember? I don't have money for big projects." His face paled and he tried to laugh it off to save face. "Danny, come on, I just thought, we're brothers, aren't we?" I shook my head, giving a faint smile. "Brothers, sure, but being brothers doesn't mean I have to pay the price for what you've done." I turned back to the kitchen, leaving him there alone with his untouched glass of wine. After that, I kept my distance from my family. Not because I hated them, but because I needed to protect myself. I'd spent my youth trying to please them, trying to prove I wasn't useless. Now that I'd found my path, I didn't want old wounds to pull me back. I focused on the Golden Fork, expanding with new locations in Miami and Chicago, each one carrying my signature. Not just in the food, but in how I treated my staff, my customers, and the community. The press continued to hail me as a self-made icon, someone who had overcome all prejudice to succeed. But to me, fame mattered less than the peace I found standing in the kitchen, knife in hand, the air filled with the scent of herbs and seafood. That was where I found myself, where old wounds no longer stung, where I wasn't Marco's useless brother or my parents' disappointing son. In the kitchen of the Golden Fork, I was Danny Horn, the storyteller through every dish, the builder of an empire from passion and sweat. But while I was soaring, my family, especially Marco, was beginning to fall into a storm none of us had foreseen. 2 years had passed since Marco's wedding. In that time, the Golden Fork continued to thrive. I opened new locations in Los Angeles and New York, each one carrying the essence of New Orleans but tailored to local tastes. International media took notice, calling me a pioneer in sustainable cuisine. I was invited to conferences, appeared on television, and even wrote a book about my journey. But I didn't let the spotlight steer me off course. I still went into the kitchen every day, testing new recipes myself, talking with farmers to ensure the freshest ingredients aligned with my philosophy. That was how I stayed grounded, how I kept the fire in my heart burning. Meanwhile, I heard bits and pieces about Marco through mutual friends or the rare calls from my mother. He was still basking in his own glory, buying more properties, attending high-profile events with Alessia by his side, always projecting the image of a winner. But I sensed something was off. The stories about him began to carry a tone of concern. Marco's taken on a lot of debt, a friend who once worked with him told me during a chance encounter. He's invested in some big projects, but the market's shaky. If he's not careful, he's headed for serious trouble. I nodded, saying nothing, but deep down, I knew Marco wasn't the type to stop. He always wanted more, always wanted bigger, and that was his double-edged sword. Then the storm hit, swift and merciless beyond anyone's predictions. That year, the U.S. real estate market collapsed, dragging countless companies and investors into a spiral of crisis. I read in the news that major projects in New Orleans, where Marco had staked his entire career, stalled due to lack of funding. The penthouses he'd once bragged about sat unsold, their value plummeting. The bank loans he'd taken to expand his empire became an unbearable burden. I wasn't surprised, but I took no joy in it. Despite how Marco had treated me, he was still my brother, and a part of me hoped he'd find a way out. But that way out never came. One morning, as I was preparing to open the main branch of the Golden Fork, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. Her voice trembled, lacking the pride or control it once had. "Danny, are you free? I need to talk." I agreed to meet her at a small cafe by the Mississippi River, a place I often went to unwind. When I arrived, she was there, looking a decade older. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee. "Marco, he's bankrupt, Danny," she said, her voice breaking. "He borrowed too much, and now the bank's taken everything. The house, the cars, it's all gone." I sat in silence, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to ask, why didn't you stop him? Why did you and Dad let Marco dive into those gambles? But I didn't. I just listened as she continued, her voice faltering between sobs. "Your father. He had to mortgage our house to cover Marco's debts. We have nothing left, Danny. I don't know what to do." She looked at me, her eyes pleading, as if I were her last hope. But I shook my head gently. "I'm sorry, Mom, I can't help." I didn't say it out of coldness or resentment. I said it because I knew that if I got involved, I'd be pulled back into the family's vortex, where I was always the loser, where my efforts were dismissed. I'd spent my life breaking free from that shadow, and now, when they needed me, I didn't want to become a tool to clean up Marco's mistakes. My mother looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears, but she said nothing more. She understood that I had changed, that I was no longer the young Danny who bowed his head to every taunt. In the days following the cafe meeting, I tried to focus on work, on new dishes for the Golden Fork, on plans to expand into Asia. But the image of my mother, with her red-rimmed eyes and trembling voice, lingered in my mind. I didn't want to think about them, didn't want the past to pull me back, but a part of me, the part that still remembered the days when my mother sang me to sleep or my father laughed loudly when I scored a goal in a kid's soccer game, couldn't fully let go. I told myself I owed them nothing, that I'd risen on my own without their help. But the heart sometimes doesn't listen to reason. Then one morning, as I was reviewing the books in the office of the Golden Fork's main branch, the doorbell chimed. I looked up, slightly surprised since it was past business hours. A staff member came in, her voice hesitant. "Boss, your whole family is outside. They want to see you." My heart tightened. The whole family? I stood up, wiped my hands on a towel, trying to keep my face calm, but inside a storm was brewing. I knew this wasn't a casual visit. They were here for a reason, and I was afraid I already knew what it was. When I stepped into the lobby, there they were, my father, my mother, and Marco. My father, who once stood tall with smug confidence, now looked weary, his shoulders slightly hunched, his old suit no longer fitting properly. My mother clutched her purse tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor as if afraid to meet mine. Marco, who had always been the center of attention, now looked like a shadow of himself. His hair was disheveled, his eyes ringed with dark circles, and the confident smile of old was gone, replaced by a tense, almost desperate expression. I stood before them, saying nothing, waiting. "Danny," my mother spoke first, her voice trembling. We need to talk." I nodded and led them to a private corner of the restaurant where the soft golden light illuminated the red brick walls. I offered them seats, called for water for all three, but no one touched their glasses. The air was heavy, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "Danny," my father began, his voice hoarse, stripped of its former authority. "We're in trouble, serious trouble. Marco, he's lost everything. The bank took all his assets and our house is about to be foreclosed. We have nothing left." He paused, looking at me, his eyes no longer those of a father who once belittled me, but of a man pleading. You're the only one who can help us now." Marco, sitting beside him, kept his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. "Danny," he said, his voice so soft I had to strain to hear it. "I was wrong. I treated you badly, I know, but we're family. I need your help, just this once." He looked up, his eyes red, and I saw a Marco I'd never seen before. Vulnerable, broken, with no trace of the brother who once mocked me in front of everyone. I sat there, looking at them, feeling like time was slowing down. Part of me wanted to shout, to remind them of the times they called me useless, laughed at my passion, made me feel like I didn't deserve to exist. But I didn't. I just looked at them, my voice calm to the point of coldness. "Back then, I was just a cheap waiter in your eyes. You said I'd never amount to anything. And now you need me because I'm the only one still standing?" My mother burst into tears, covering her mouth. "Danny, don't say that. We're family. Even if we were wrong, even if we hurt you, we're still blood. You can't abandon us." My father nodded, his voice choking. "Danny, I'm sorry. I was wrong not to believe in you, but we need you now. Just this once." I looked at Marco. He said nothing more, just kept his head down as if unable to face me. I thought back to that night at La Belle Creole, when he laughed loudly in front of the whole restaurant, calling me a waiter. I remembered his wedding, when he dragged me on stage to mock me, only to freeze when the truth about me was revealed. And now here he was, begging me to save him from his own mistakes. I stood up, looking straight at them. "I spent my whole life proving I'm not the person you thought I was. I built everything myself without any help from this family. You didn't believe in me when I needed you most. Now when you need me, you expect me to forget everything that happened?" I paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm not a tool to fix Marco's mistakes. I'm not someone you can turn to when you've run out of options." My mother cried harder. My father bowed his head, and Marco clenched his fists as if trying to suppress anger or shame. "Danny," he said, his voice trembling, "you can't do this. We're brothers." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt neither anger nor pain. Just a cold clarity. "Brothers," I repeated evenly, "but being brothers doesn't mean I have to bear the consequences of your choices. You chose your path, Marco. Now you have to face it." I turned and walked back to the kitchen, leaving them sitting there in silence. I didn't look back, didn't want to see their faces. I knew my mother would cry, my father would stay quiet, and Marco would be angry. But I also knew that this time I couldn't let them pull me down. I'd fought too long to stand tall, and I wasn't going to lose myself just to save a family that had once turned its back on me. As the kitchen door closed behind me, I heard my mother call my name, but I didn't stop. I picked up a knife and started chopping herbs, the familiar scent soothing my mind. In this kitchen, I was myself. In this kitchen, I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. And in this kitchen, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not out of coldness, but because I deserved to live the life I'd built for myself. A few weeks later, I heard that Alessia had left Marco. The marriage, once celebrated as a fairy tale, had crumbled in bitterness. Marco, stripped of his wealth and reputation, became a shadow of himself. The friends who once surrounded him turned their backs. The partners who once praised him now avoided him like a curse. My parents, who had once swelled with pride over Marco's extravagant gifts, now faced poverty. The house they'd mortgaged wasn't enough to cover the debts, and tensions within the family began to erupt. My mother blamed my father for encouraging Marco's borrowing. My father blamed Marco for his reckless ambition. Marco, in his desperation, blamed the world, everyone but himself. I heard through the grapevine that my parents had moved to a small apartment in the suburbs of New Orleans, far from the lavish parties and boasts about their golden son. Marco, meanwhile, fell into an abyss of ruin. After Alessia left him, he lost all credibility in the real estate world. The friends who once flocked to him now turned away, and the partners who once sang his praises steered clear as if he were cursed. I heard he tried to find new work, but the shadow of his failure loomed too large, and Marco, who had once stood proudly at the top, was now just a faded name in passing stories. I didn't take pleasure in hearing this. Despite the pain they'd caused me, despite the mockery that once made me feel unworthy of existing, I never wished for their downfall. But I couldn't save them either. I'd learned that sometimes family ties aren't enough to erase wounds, and forgiveness doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. I chose to keep my distance, not out of hatred, but because I needed to protect the fire within me, the fire that had carried me through years of being belittled to become the person I am today. One day, as I was preparing for a live television interview, the host asked me a question I hadn't anticipated. "Danny, you've achieved everything, fame, success, a culinary empire. But what about your family? What role did they play in your journey?" The question hit like a knife, not because it hurt, but because it forced me to confront the scars I'd tried to bury. I smiled, took a deep breath, and answered, "I've learned that respect is worth more than hollow family ties. My family, they taught me how to stand up when no one believed in me, and I'm proud to have held on to my dignity." That brief but honest answer silenced the studio. I didn't delve into the years of being dismissed, the humiliating night at La Belle Creole, or the shameful moment at Marco's wedding. I didn't need to. What I'd done, what I'd achieved, spoke for itself. After the interview, social media exploded with posts about me, about that quote. Some called me a self-made hero, others said I was proof you don't need anyone's validation to succeed. But to me, the praise wasn't what mattered. It was the peace of knowing I'd lived true to myself. I don't know if my family ever felt regret. I don't know if Marco ever found his way again, or if my parents ever acknowledged their mistakes. But I don't need those answers. I've walked through darkness, overcome mockery, and built a world of my own. And as the light from the kitchen shines on my face, I know that no matter how bitter life can be, I've found my own emotional justice, not through revenge, but by living a life worth being proud of.